Soddor Children Disappearance, a Christmas crime. The small town of Fayetteville in West Virginia sits near the New River Gorge and was recently labeled one of the coolest small towns in America, attracting tourists from all over the country. On Christmas Eve 1945, a mystery befell the town that left 5 children unaccounted for. What began as a tragedy turned into something a little more disturbing when rumors began circulating that the children were still alive. George Soddor, born Giorgio Soddor, immigrated to the United States from Italy with his brother in 1908, age 13. Once they passed customs, his older brother returned to Italy and George remained in the States. After working various dead-end jobs in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, he started his own trucking company. And through his work, he met the love of his life, another Italian immigrant, Jenny Cipriani. By the time 1923 had come around, the couple had married and were settled in the coolest town in America, Fayetteville. They ended up becoming a respected family within the town and had 10 children by 1943. Though George was well known in the community, it wasn't all good. He would argue with other immigrants about his steadfast opposition to the Italian politician Benito Mussolini, and throughout his time in Fayetteville, he had never told anyone why he had left his motherland at such a young age. Missing on the night of the 24th of December 1945 was Soddor's second eldest son, Joe, who was serving in the military during the last days of the Second World War. In the house on that faithful and cold West Virginian night were George, Jenny, and their remaining 9 children. Marion, their eldest daughter, aged 22, had turned up at the family home in the early evening bearing gifts for the younger children. After finishing her shift at a local discount store, it was a last-minute surprise as the younger siblings hadn't expected her to show up. At around 10 p.m., excited at the prospect of having the family together and more gifts, Jenny let some of the younger children stay up later than usual with 2 of their older brothers, 14-year-old Maurice and 9-year-old Louis. By that point, George and the 2 eldest sons, 23-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., were already asleep. After reminding the excited children of their chores, Jenny went to bed with her 2-year-old daughter, Sylvia. Just gone midnight, Jenny awoke to the sound of the telephone ringing, which was unusual for that time of night. She ran downstairs and answered it to hear a drunk woman on the other end asking to speak to someone Jenny hadn't heard of. In the background, she could hear people laughing and celebrating what sounded like a raucous Christmas Eve party. She informed the mystery caller she had the wrong number and hung up, but not before noting the woman had an unusual laugh. On her way back upstairs, she saw the lights were still on in the living room and curtains remained open, minor chores the children were expected to have carried out. As she approached the room, she saw Marion asleep on the couch and assumed that the other children had retreated to the attic room where they normally slept. Jenny tidied up and went back to bed, but her slumber didn't last long. At 1 a.m., she was awoken by the sound of something hitting the roof of the house. It wasn't uncommon, as birds would sometimes walk around on the roof, but this was something heavier. When she didn't hear the sound again, she went back to sleep for just 30 minutes. At 1:30 a.m., she awoke to the smell of smoke drifting through the house. Alarmed, she jumped out of bed and found George's office on fire, flames licking the sides of the walls. She alerted George and her eldest sons, who called to the children in the attic, and then they charged out of the house. George and Jenny escaped with 4 of their children, Marion, who was on the couch downstairs, John and George Jr. on the first floor, and 2-year-old Sylvia. Realizing the 5 children in the attic were not with them, they frantically tried to get back into the house to either call to them or rescue them. The flames were too thick and the smoke was overwhelming. George and his sons wanted to climb the side of the house into the attic, but the ladder, which was normally positioned on the side of the house, was nowhere to be seen. They then tried to move George's trucks to the house to climb up, but despite working fine on Christmas Eve, they didn't start. George resorted to climbing the wall and managed to reach the attic window, but slashed his arm open on the glass and fell to the ground. The flames then burst out the attic window. Marion ran to the neighbor's house and called the fire brigade. The fire had become so strong that it was seen by a driver near one of the taverns on Fayetteville's main street. The 6 members of the Soddor family could do nothing but watch for the next hour as the house burned to the ground. They assumed the 5 younger children had perished. It took another 3 hours for the fire department to arrive. The delay was put down to many firefighters being involved in the Second World War. When the fire engine arrived, it was beyond too late. The Soddors were on the lawn staring in shock at the remains of their home. After dousing the simmering site with water, the firefighters searched the remains for signs of the children's bodies. At around 10 a.m., George was informed by the fire chief that there were no bones in the ashes, and that as far as he could tell, there were no bodies and no children. The Soddors were told it was possible the 5 children had been completely incinerated due to the heat of the fire, but George was beginning to suspect something darker was at work. 4 days later, distressed at the sight of the rubble, he used farming equipment to bulldoze the foundation of the house and cover it all in a thick layer of soil. On the 29th of December, a coroner concluded a brief inquest that the fire was a result of faulty wiring. 1 day later, official death certificates were issued for each of the 5 children, despite no body parts or evidence of their deaths having been found. A local newspaper, God bless them, reported that all 5 bodies had in fact been found, but this was an embellishment of the facts that had been received. On the 2nd of January 1946, the 5 children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny Jr., 8, and Betty, 5, were given funerals. A few weeks later, George's suspicions came back to haunt him, and Jenny was struggling with unanswered questions of her own. George found his ladder at the bottom of an embankment over 20 meters away from the house. It had always been at the side of the house, except the night of the fire. Jenny remembered the Christmas lights had been on as they left the house, so the conclusion it had been an electric fire didn't make any sense to her as the lights were still on. A telephone repairman later said the phone line to the house had been deliberately cut and not burned through as suspected. And the biggest question of all that hung over them, more so than the cloud of grief that consumed their hearts, was the fact that there were no bodies. Jenny refused to believe the official version of events. In a similar house fire in a neighboring county, a family of 7 were tragically killed, but their skeletal remains were found. She also found it strange that some of her household appliances and items were found burned among the rubble, when the bones of her children were not. George and Jenny began researching to find out what had really happened. Jenny visited a local crematorium who told her that the remnants of human bones would remain after being burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 whole hours, which was for longer and hotter than the house fire. Or was it? The Soddors and their neighbors reported that the fire lasted around 1 hour before collapsing into virtually nothing. However, the fire brigade took at least 3 hours to get there, by which point parts of the tin roof were covering the basement. If the children were in the house and succumbed to the smoke inhalation, then as the house collapsed, they would have fallen into the basement with the tin roof on top of them. The basement also held some coal reserves for the house, which would have turned the tin-covered storage room into a furnace. The most logical conclusion is that the 5 Soddor children died in the fire and were incinerated through the unfortunate way the tin roof covered the coal-laden basement. But for George and Jenny, they began to believe their children were taken, and there is merit to their beliefs. In October 1945, a door-to-door salesman visited the home and spoke to George, who ended up arguing with him about his Italian political beliefs. The salesman walked off in anger and warned George that his house would go up in smoke and his children will be destroyed. A few weeks later, a contractor seeking work as an electrician turned up at the house and told George his fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. This was despite the house being rewired and signed off by an electrical company just months before. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, George Jr. and John reported seeing a strange vehicle in the area with 2 men inside. They became worried as they believed the men were watching their younger siblings go to and from school. By this point, George and Jenny wholeheartedly believed the fire had been caused by arson, and at one point suspected the Italian mafia due to George's vocal criticism of Italy's government. They believed the phone call to the house just after midnight was to make sure they were inside for when the arsonist turned up. The sound on the roof that woke Jenny up could have been the perpetrator attempting to start the blaze, though it remains uncertain why someone would cause the fire at the top of the house and not the lower levels, in the knowledge that fire rises unless they were taking the children out of the attic first. Interestingly, the drunk woman who had called the house with an unusual laugh was tracked down by investigators in the days after the fire. She told them it was a genuine wrong number and there was no ulterior motive. But that raises another question. If the phone line to the house was deliberately cut, then it must have happened between the time that the drunk woman phoning the house just after midnight and the time Jenny smelled smoke around 1:30 a.m. According to the Soddors' neighbors, they saw a man near their property stealing some ropes and cables from the grounds. He was later arrested and also questioned on the fire, which was literally next door around the same time. He admitted to stealing the ropes and cables and also admitted to cutting the phone line because he thought it was a power line. He wanted to cut it so that the homeowners wouldn't be able to run on electrics or lights to spot him. It is assumed the man would have used the ladder from the side of the Soddor house to reach the phone line above before discarding it on the embankment. This answered the question of the ladder being missing. This suspect has never been named, but it is reported he was fined for the theft. In March 1946, the Soddor family planted flowers in the soil where the house stood, and Jenny tended to the memorial garden for the rest of her life. But the unanswered questions around the fire just kept piling up. A bus driver who was passing through the town on Christmas Eve witnessed a group of boys throwing balls of fire at the house but didn't think anything of it at the time. When the snow thawed, Jenny searched the area around the memorial garden and found a rubber ball that could have been doused with petrol and lit. It could also be the sound she heard on the roof. Then came the witnesses claiming they had seen the children after the fire had destroyed the Soddors' lives. A local woman who was watching the fire from her own house saw a car pass by and recognized some of the younger Soddor children inside the car, but it was late and dark and her vision could have been unclear, except she was adamant it was the children. On Christmas morning, over 100 miles away on the main road to Charleston, a waitress said she had served breakfast to the 5 children who were with some adults and noticed the car they came in had Florida license plates. In 1949, George saw a photograph of a young ballet dancer in New York and became consumed with the belief it was his daughter, Betty. He traveled all the way to New York to find the girl at her school, but he was refused entry and had to be restrained. The family tried to get the FBI involved on the basis it was a kidnapping, and director J. Edgar Hoover personally responded to their inquiries. He cited that in fact it was something for local police and services to look into, and if they needed the FBI's help, they would ask for it. They never did. In August 1949, the family enlisted a pathologist to scour through the dirt under the memorial garden, and remarkably, he found some bones. The vertebrae belonged to the same person and was aged in their late teens and early 20s, not a child's. But the very fact that bones had been found that were not the children's bones bolstered the Soddors' belief the children had not been in the house at the time of the fire. The pathologist concluded the bones had come from the soil George had covered the site in. The family never gave up hope that the 5 children were alive, and they carried that belief with them for the rest of their lives, in unending pain that would never ever be resolved. After more sightings in 1952, the family raised enough funds to put up a billboard at the memorial garden with the pictures of all 5 children listed as missing, along with a $10,000 reward for information. Around the same time, over 200 miles away in Charleston, a hotel owner claimed to have seen the children 1 week after the house fire. She said they were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian descent. It remains unclear how factual her story was or why she came forward many years after the fire. As the years passed, more sightings came in. From a covenant in Missouri to a bar in Texas, the case had become so well known that sightings and stories were popping up all over the place, and it was left to George to follow up all the leads in person. It had become his life's mission to find his missing children. A 1967 tip led George back to Texas, where a woman claimed one of his sons was living there under a new identity. He even met the man who denied he was George's missing son, but it didn't stop him believing. Consumed with his mission, George was coming up against brick walls everywhere he turned. He remained unconvinced that his children had died in the fire and never gave up looking for them. Upon his death in 1969, Jenny remained in the family home and only went out wearing black in a constant state of grief. She died in 1989, the same day the billboard was finally removed from the memorial garden. The Soddor children, apart from John, who wanted to move on, took up their parents' life mission and continued to raise awareness of the case. Sylvia Soddor, who was 2 years old at the time of the fire, died in 2021 and reported having experienced her parents' grief long into adulthood. She too believed her siblings didn't die in the fire. She promised her parents she would keep the story alive, the same promise made to her by her own children. It seems logical the children would have died in a fire that burned for many hours. In a story kept alive by a family suffering immense grief, looking for any thread of hope, the children were alive. It could be that the mysterious disappearance of the Soddor children is a story that had perpetrated due to the family suffering from immense survivor's guilt. Yet logic doesn't always work, and there are so many threads to this case that don't quite add up that the suggestion the children were kidnapped remains a possibility. I'll bet one that has never been proven. This is a strong chance the fire was caused by arson, and if it was, the Soddor children were killed, then someone seems to have gotten away with the murders of 5 children.